from considerations of derived theory to concepts of ego and self, and expresses a cultural transition toward acknowledging gayness as a valid way of being. A new theoretical stance on homosexuality based on Jung's idea of individuality and its unfoldment, rather than ideas of abnormality and disturbance, is called for by this social reorientation. The primary source for these changes is not difficult to locate. Gay people have declared their right to exist so well that other views of gays as incomplete are shown as unjust. It is no more correct to label a homosexual incapable of individuation because of his homosexuality than it is to call an African, quote, primitive, unquote, and thus treat her as subhuman. Modern biopsychosocial research demonstrates that gay people exist in and from their identity as gay. A new psychology of homosexuality requires Jung's phenomenological view of psyche, for in that way the natural experience of gay-identified personality can be accurately seen, rather than being distorted through prejudicial lenses. Nowhere in his writings does Jung articulate a soul psychology for homosexuals. Nowhere, quote, does he give an example of homosexual practice in a highly individuated human being, unquote, at least not up front. But starting from his viewpoint on individuality, such as soul psychology of gays, notice I'm equating individuality with soul psychology. This is again technical understanding, whatever. Volumes of material behind these simple references. They're not little cliche things you dig up out of nowhere just because you're fiddling your thumbs in theory. That's not what's going on. You could not write that way. You know, it looks innocuous. It's not. These are heavy-duty concepts with enormous theoretical implications. They've been enormously thought out. We can discuss them more as you might be interested. I just thought I'd point that out again because otherwise it wouldn't look like that. It would just look like, yeah. But starting from his viewpoint on individuality, such a soul psychology of gays can be developed to conceive of, quote, individuation as gay, unquote, in which the realization of the self is capitalized there to reference the archetypal self, not the little self or existential self, occurs through being homosexual. Models of gay individuation can then be explored, and it has been done in the work on individuation as heterosexual, that is, in terms of the conjunctio as the anima and animus, and that kind of soul image of their union. Any consideration of homosexuality must start with the recognition that gay people insist on being seen in their own terms. For example, from a contemporary gay viewpoint, being gay is not the same as being homosexual. The word, quote, gay, unquote, refers, quote, not merely to the sexual orientation of the individuals or group of individuals, but to the purposeful self-definition of these individuals and groups who see their homosexuality as an inherently positive phenomenon, who actively oppose the political, social, and legal oppression of homosexuality, and who have, as a conscious social aim, the formation of a supportive, progressive, and visible community within a larger social context, unquote. And so that's from Robert Hockey's paper in the JP. From a gay perspective, being gay is a matter of having a gay-identified ego, not one of sexuality per se. Sexuality in gays, rather, serves the development of the personality, just as it does for persons whose libido is heterosexually organized. The ego's search for meaning in a homosexual organization of the personality is the principal concern of the psyche in gay people. In terms of, quote, telos, unquote, see, I'll keep coming back to that. Being gay expresses the intent of the self in a particular person. This view also follows from Jung's second theory of homosexuality, there should be a comment there, that it is, quote, constitutional, unquote, or, quote, determined by genetic or biological factors, unquote. In terms of the ego-self axis, another technical term, being gay involves the individuation of a homosexual relationship between the ego and the self, that's the axis, parallel to the heterosexually organized relations Jung has articulated, especially in accord with the anima. Indeed, in a gay person, the structures of personality organized by the developing libido will individuate homosexually. That's a typo, it's an important typo. It should read individuate homosexually, not the way it reads there. That's a serious error. It makes a wrong reading, an incorrect reading. It should read, will individuate homosexually. The structures of personality will individuate homosexually. Okay, next section. The sections didn't have numbers, so I eliminated them. They just had titles. Homosexual organization of the libido. Richard Friedman, in his psychoanalytic study of homosexuality, demonstrates that biopsychosocial research into sexuality supersedes Freudian views in terms of an accurate understanding, a position echoed by Hockey vis-a-vis Jung. Monique also identified Jung's views on sexuality as outdated, especially his non-treatment of masculine sexuality. As Monique makes clear, quote, Jung assumed the importance of phallus psychologically without exploring the basis of the assumption, unquote. In fact, there is a, quote, avoidance of focused attention upon male sexuality, unquote. Monique suggests that, quote, Jung was leery of physicality, unquote. That's a nice way of saying something nally-nally. But whether true or not, quote, the fact remains, unquote, that Jung did not engage in, quote, significant direct research on phallus, which has resulted in a fundamental disservice to the importance of the archetypal masculine, a theoretical imbalance that cries out to be redressed, unquote. You might mention he was sorely tempted in ways that never made it into the record book, but he couldn't go so far as to ever be official. He was too humiliated by his own interest to see himself be that way. I'm serious. If he had a homo side, or he wouldn't have done what he did and got into it. We get into that someday. Very interesting stuff. Very closeted stuff. Jung emphasized the feminine in his analysis of homosexuality, just as he did in many other areas, such as his treatment of parental origins. But perhaps gay male psychology is deeply involved with the masculine. This is suggested by Jung's third theory of homosexuality, that it represents, quote, an incomplete detachment from the original archetype of the hermaphrodite, unquote, an image of wholeness. If one of Jung's theories of homosexuality characterizes a, quote, incomplete detachment, unquote, from the psychological feminine, then in terms of achieving an eventual individuated hermaphroditism, there needs to be a corresponding theory of, quote, incomplete detachment, unquote, from the masculine. A theory of homosexual relationship to the archetypal male. At this time, that would be, it's by itself radical. No one had ever suggested that, believe it or not, that gay men had to do with male. I'm serious about this. No one had thought that. This is extremely radical. That's it, So, but that's it. Until no one responded to this article. No one. I heard nothing. Nothing. Okay. To understand, so now I'm going to change the title. To understand such a relationship, it's necessary to have a new idea of homosexuals and of psychosexual development generally, rather than distorting preconceptions. It is here that biopsychosocial research provides a firmer foundation for theorizing than psychoanalysis. Friedman has shown in detail how a picture of homosexuals seen from the perspective of modern research can be understood psychoanalytically. Rather than in terms of the old drive theory, he says, psychosexual development should be seen as concerning construction of the, quote, self-concept, unquote. The, quote, sense of self-cohesion, unquote, that exists in rudimentary form even in earliest infancy, and which develops through the formation of structure to become the, quote, sense of identity, unquote, of young adulthood. This self develops through two psychosexually, as another typo there, two psychosexually organized stages. The first occurs in the differentiation of, quote, core gender identity, unquote, as male or female during the second year. So we'll just naturally all become identified like that for the most part. Like I think it's about 99.9% of people do that. Naturally develop this core gender identity. It has nothing to do with language, or even particularly enculturation. It's more crude or fundamental or brainstem level. Following this period of structure formation, gender identity is stable and at the center of the unfolding self, having to do with the little brain is still forming with that age too. The next stage concerns, quote, erotic fantasy differentiation, unquote, when, quote, the affect of lust, biologically programmed to increase in intensity during later childhood, functions at that time as a new organizer of inner life, unquote. It is during this period that, quote, lust and image are irreversibly linked, unquote, and thereby, quote, the gender self of early childhood is modified and becomes a sexual gender self, unquote, now organized by homosexual, heterosexual, or mixed erotic fantasy life. It's now describing the age from around thus 2 to 11. The differentiated sexual gender self becomes the core in the adolescent emergence of the ego, the mature sense of identity whose development is discussed by Erik Erikson and others. This model of psychosexual development, which reflects the biopsychosocial understanding, radically departs from earlier psychoanalytic views. It separates gender identity from sexual object choice, and reformulates being gay in terms of a homosexual organization of the self. The two, homosexuality and the self, are not to be separated, but intertwined. Both straights and gays are capable of the maturity described by psychoanalysts. Thus, a new psychoanalytic model can explain a homosexual organization of the libido, which structures the self, that's a technical phrasing, by the way, which can be unpacked at great length, and that's my dissertation goes, which structures the self and can be seen as a, quote, natural, unquote, process for some individuals. The idea of a homosexual organization of the libido, I repeat that phrase, you know, homosexual organization of the libido, So libido is a key theoretical understanding in those hidden as such. As just libido theory, you might call it. As distinct from a heterosexual organization, then, would also underlie any attempt to understand issues concerning psyche in gays, such as their relationship with the unconscious. For a homosexually organized man, the quote, orientation, unquote, of the god Eros would have to be gay. The relationship to phallus would be homosexual, and the relationship with the feminine and the anima would be a gay rather than a straight one. His inner universe would be gay. Doesn't that sound so common sense, right? To understand gay men requires the ability to perceive in a, quote, gay way, unquote, within a libidinal economy and an archetypal cosmology with gods of homosexual love. No one had ever written that before, by the way. With gods of homosexual, no one had ever written like that, believe it or not. It becomes understandable then how homophobically adapted heterosexual men, such as Jung, would find the attempt, not completely heterosexual, would find the attempt to achieve a homosexual understanding of psyche difficult, thus precluding any in-depth consideration of this area. In the case of male-female incest, a subject of potentially equal horror to that of homosexual fellows, Jung speaks at length, but he could get up no enthusiasm for the world of gay love. With this precedent set, Jungians can only echo it. Usually, and that's them, that's the editors. That was not there originally. Okay, you get that difference. With this precedent set, Jungians can only echo it, turning a blind eye to homosexual eros. Usually they want to exempt themselves, the little fuckers, right? Usually it's bullshit. Turning a blind eye to homosexual eros while gay people continue to develop a culture, develop culture, communities, and personalities as gay. Okay, homosexual archetypes. Where can homosexual organized archetypes be found? They can be studied in images from literature, arts, mythology, and dreams. For example, in his Symposium, Plato tells us that Aphrodite Urania, daughter of Uranos, was the goddess of gay love, whereas a different goddess, Aphrodite Dione, that should not be Dionia, but that's okay, Dionia, daughter of Zeus and Dione, oh there it is, was the goddess of heterosexual love. Not only that, Plato says further that each goddess had her own son. So actually there are two gods of love, an eros of homosexual love and an eros of heterosexual love. Plato thus proposes two, quote, homosexual archetypes, unquote, one female and one male, which embody a homosexual organization of love. Plato goes even further yet. He tells us the story of the origin of the emotion of love, when in mythic times humans were twice what they are now, having 4 arms and 4 legs, etc. Some of these beings, were round beings originally, were formed of 2 males, some of 2 females, and some of a male and a female. When Zeus split these beings in 2 to have their power, make them less powerful, he created love, which is the yearning of each split half to rejoin its, quote, other half, unquote. So those who are part of male-female wholes pursue heterosexual union, while those of the same-sex whole pursue homosexual union. The former follow Aphrodite Dionia and her eros, and the latter Aphrodite Urania and her eros. In Jungian terms, the original Platonic hermaphrodite broken into male and female describes a heterosexual anima/animus dynamic. It is all too typical that the, quote, union of sames, unquote, in Plato's story has not been discussed by Jungians, parenthesis, with the exception of June Singer, who has done it in a distorted, trivialized version, and parenthesis, by the way, in June Singer's version, it's a long forgotten book, she says the homosexual version is a secondary subset from the original split of the dual-sexed version. It's not only just marred, it's mutilated, it's not, she cheapens it. That's why I said distorted, trivialized version. You shouldn't even read it, actually. So, Plato in the Symposium has provided an archetypal image. That's, by the way, that's their error again. Technically, that's a mistake. They had shortened the sentence and they put words together and it didn't really work.